Hi guys, Wheelie here. Today I'm going to show you how to crochet my Zig-zag Infinity Scarf. It's a fantastic winter scarf because it's very dense. You can see there are very few gaps or holes in this fabric. The Zig-zag Infinity Scarf pattern is suitable for adventurous beginners and intermediate crocheters. I don't call this a beginner pattern because the puff stitches, which have this lovely zigzag or herringbone effect, are spiked puff stitches. When you're learning the technique, it can be a little tricky to work out where to place your stitches because instead of working into the row immediately below, these puff stitches are worked 2 rows below. Once you've got the hang of that technique, this isn't a complicated scarf. I've worked with a DK yarn today. It's not really that cold even in winter in the part of Australia I live, but if you live somewhere that's actually cold, you might like to use a heavier weight yarn. I'd love to see how your scarf turns out, so do tag me on Instagram so I can admire. And I'd appreciate it if you could hit the like button on this video if you're saving this pattern to make later. With this pattern, gauge or matching your stitch size to mine is not crucial. I know a lot of people prefer to avoid gauge swatches if they can, so hopefully I've made your day a little brighter. For this pattern, I suggest you focus more on how your stitches look and how the fabric you create feels. I love using this pattern because it creates such a warm scarf, but if you make your stitches too tight, there's a genuine risk that you'll create a fabric that is too thick and stiff to be comfortable or have a nice drape. I'm going to use this sage yarn today. I do think this scarf looks good in basic solid colour yarn, and it's easier for you to see where I'm placing my stitches when I work with yarn like this. But check this out. This is a swatch crocheted from Lion Brand Landscapes yarn, which is a really vibrantly coloured, shiny acrylic yarn. Don't the colour changes look gorgeous? I think the spiked puff stitch works really well with a variegated yarn, and this has to be one of the most dramatic, colourful yarns I've ever used. And to inspire you a little more, Peyton's Sierra yarn. Here's the swatch. I think I'm in love. This yarn is so sophisticated. It's gorgeous, isn't it? The colour changes are so interesting. The yarn itself is interesting too. There's variation in the thickness and some sections of it are more twisted. In terms of texture, it is so soft. I'd love to make something like a jumper or a cardi from it. If you do decide to use a multicolour yarn and you're going to join the ends, I'll get you to start your scarf just slightly differently to help you to hide the join, because you'll likely be starting with one colour and ending with a different colour, unless you get very lucky with the colour placement in the yarn. Okay, enough yarn admiring. Before I start the tutorial, I'll explain how this pattern works. The scarf is arranged in what I call panels and dividers. The panels are these sections of puff stitch, and the dividers are the rows of single crochet that separate them. And you just alternate between them. Panel, divider, panel, divider, until your scarf is the length you'd like. The number of panels you'll need to crochet will depend on the yarn you use and your own stitch style. When you're happy with the length, I'll show you the method I use to sew the ends together. This is the join here. Today I'm working with this very basic solid colour acrylic yarn. I'll be using 2 balls of this lovely sage colour. You can use a DK yarn like me, or you can use a heavier weight yarn if you'd like a warmer scarf. As well as your yarn, you'll need a crochet hook, scissors, a big-eyed needle, and it may be worth having a stitch marker to hand. When you're selecting your hook, I suggest you go up 0.5 millimeter from the recommended hook size for your yarn. So I'm using a 4.5 millimeter hook today. I suggest a larger hook because while it's lovely to have thick, cozy material, you also want your scarf to be able to bend. That is kind of important, and quite honestly, you could end up with a very rigid scarf if you work with a usual hook size. If you have a very loose crochet style, you may be fine, but do keep an eye on the drape. Put a slip knot on your hook and make a starting chain. The starting chain needs to be an even number, and the length of this chain will be roughly the width of your scarf. I'm going to chain 24, and that will give me a scarf that's about 5.5 inches or 14.5 centimeters wide. Here's my chain of 24. The first row is just single crochets worked into this chain. However, I like to work into the back of the chain. The front of the chain is the smooth, flat side where each chain has a V shape. When you work into the front of the chain, you just insert your hook down into the V and catch one loop like this. You'll be quite familiar with that. You may also be familiar with working into the back of the chain. When you turn the chain over, you'll see each chain has a bump. If I turn it to the side, you'll be able to see the bumps more clearly. To work into the back of the chain, you insert your hook and catch one loop, The loop you catch is that central back bump of the chain. When you work into the back bumps, you get a really flat bottom to your work, which will mean when it comes time to join the ends of the scarf together, the seam will be less conspicuous. So it isn't a make or break thing. If you prefer to work into the chain in the usual way, you definitely can. It is a bit more time consuming to work into the back bumps, and I'm only doing it for a small cosmetic reason, to make the finishing seam a little less noticeable. We're going to begin single crocheting in the second chain from the hook. So if you're working into the chain from the front, don't count the loop on your hook. Count back 1V, 2V, and insert your hook into the second V, catching one loop, and work your first single crochet. Or turn your chain over, count back 1 bump, 2 bump, and insert your hook into the second bump, catching one loop. So I have one loop on my hook back here, and I have one piece of yarn from my chain. Yarn over and pull through the chain to pull up a loop. There are 2 loops on the hook. Yarn over and pull through both loops to single crochet. If you have trouble recognizing where your rows end, so where to place the final stitch in a row, I recommend you grab your stitch marker and slip it under that first V. So not the yarn that is on the hook, this V shape here. And that will help you at the end of the second row to make sure you don't miss a stitch. From here, we're going to put 1 single crochet into each bump on the chain, or into each chain, depending on whether you worked into the back of the chain or the front of the chain. So just single crochet your way along. Your stitch count for row 1 will be your starting chain minus 1. I started with a chain of 24. I'm going to have 23 stitches in my first row. I'm going to jump ahead a little now and leave you to single crochet. I'll meet you at the end of the first row. I'm going to work into this final chain here, and that will finish row 1. At the end of the first row, you should have a nice strip of single crochet. You'll notice that because I worked into the back bumps, my strip of single crochet is flat at the top and at the bottom. I've got this V shape to my stitches from the bottom as well. You might like to double check that you have an odd number of stitches. The pattern for the zigzag puff section, which will start in a few rows, will only work with an odd number. Start counting with the V that you put the stitch marker under at the beginning. Count your way across, counting the V. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. You don't need to watch me count, so I'll skip this. If you're working with a solid colour yarn, start the scarf by doing exactly what I do. I'm going to create half a divider, which will be 4 rows of single crochet, before I start the first panel of spiked puff stitch. However, if you're using a multicolour yarn like this one, you might prefer to start with a full divider so that when you sew your scarf ends together, you'll be joining the top of a zigzag puff section to the bottom of a divider instead of joining halfway through a divider. That will make the change in colour between the two ends a little less noticeable. So if you're using a multicolour yarn, you have the option of working 8 rows of single crochet at the start of your scarf, while the rest of us will only work 4 rows. When you're sure you have an odd number of stitches, we'll get into row 2. Start the row by chaining 1 and turning, so we can head back in the other direction. For this row, we'll put 1 single crochet into each stitch from the row below. Start by putting a single crochet in the first stitch. The chain 1 we did before turning does not count as a stitch. If you need a little help to find the spot you work your first stitch, look at your work from above. Do not count the loop on your hook. Count V's from the hook. 1, 2, and into the second V is where you'll work the first single crochet of the row. The second V from the hook is the top of the last single crochet of the previous row. Insert your hook under both loops of the V, yarn over and pull up a loop. There are 2 loops on the hook, yarn over and pull through 2. If you'd like to, you can put a stitch marker under the V at the top of that stitch, so you'll be able to find where to place the last stitch of the next row really easily. Otherwise, let's keep single crocheting. Remember, it's 1 single crochet in each stitch from the previous row. Nice and easy. I'll leave you to do that, and I'll meet you near the end of the row. Your final stitch of the row will go into the top of the stitch that you marked with a stitch marker at the beginning of row 1. So your stitch count for this row will be the same as your stitch count for the previous row, which is your starting chain minus 1. That is row 2 finished. The next couple of rows follow the same pattern. If you're working in solid colour yarn, you'll work another 2 rows of this single crochet pattern, so you'll have 4 rows of single crochet altogether. If you're working in multicolour yarn, you might prefer to work another 6 rows of this pattern, so you'll have 8 rows of single crochet altogether. I'll meet you when you've done those rows of single crochet and we can start the first panel of the puff stitch pattern together. At the end of row 4 or row 8, if you're working in multicolour yarn, you'll have a swatch of single crochet. All the rows have the same stitch count, so your little bit of crochet should have straight sides. From here, I'm going to refer to the row numbers as though you're working in solid colour yarn, or I think it will get a bit confusing. If you're working in multicolour yarn and started with 8 rows of single crochet, you'll need to mentally adjust the row numbers by 4. For row 5, chain 1 and turn. Row 5 is still worked in single crochet, but we're no longer going to be putting 1 single crochet in every stitch. We're going to single crochet, chain 1, skip 1, single crochet, creating a little pattern of single crochets and chain spaces. Start by single crocheting in the first stitch, the same as you did in the previous rows. But from here, the new pattern starts. Chain 1, skip the next stitch and single crochet in the one after. If you look at your work from above, you can see the shape of the V's. We're going to skip the next V and single crochet into the V after it. And just keep doing that. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet in the next one. If you look at it from above, we skip this V and single crochet into that V. Chain 1, skip 1, single crochet into the next, which is creating a little pattern that is quite hard to see with single crochet because it's such a short stitch, but there is a chain space after the first single crochet, there is a chain space after the second single crochet, there is a chain space after the third single crochet. So that is the pattern we're creating for this row. I'll leave you to keep repeating that. I'll jump ahead a little and meet you near the end of the row. So I have just put a single crochet in the third last stitch of the row. If you look at my work from above, you can see I've got 2 empty V's there. 2 empty V's. I'm going to chain 1, skip this V and single crochet in the final V of the row, which you might have marked with a stitch marker if you know you have trouble. So at the end of row 5, you should have your swatch of single crochet, but your final row now has single crochet, chain 1 space, single crochet, chain 1 space. I know those chain 1 spaces are pretty hard to see with single crochets because they're such a short stitch, but they are there, and they're what we're going to be working into in the next row. So the next row is where the gorgeous mini puff zigzag stitch begins, and we're going to begin by chaining 1 and turning. And once again, we're going to put a single crochet into that very first spot, the last stitch in the previous row, which you can find by counting back the V's. Remember, you don't count the loop on your hook, you count back 1 V, the second V, and you put your single crochet under that second V. Our next stitch is going to be worked, I'm going to spread it out so you can see, into row 4. So here is the chain space. We're going to ignore that chain space and work into the stitch immediately below it. Yarn over, insert the hook into the stitch below the chain space. There are 2 loops on the hook and also the top of the V from the stitch from row 4. Yarn over and pull through the stitch to pull up a loop. Pull it up reasonably high. There are 3 loops on the hook now. Yarn over and insert the hook into the row 4 stitch for a second time. Now there are 4 loops on the hook back here and the top of the stitch. Yarn over and pull up a loop. There are 5 loops on the hook. Yarn over and pull through all 5. If you have trouble, rotate the hook down, hold on to the bottom of the stitch and you'll find your hook slides through more easily. Or you can go through a loop or 2 at a time if that's easier for you. That's the first mini puff done. Well done. Now chain 1, we're going to skip the next stitch If you look at your work from above, the next stitch is this V, then there is the chain 1 in row 5. We're going to work into this little line of yarn here, which is the row 4 stitch below the chain space. Yarn over, insert your hook into that stitch below the chain space. There are 2 loops on the hook. Yarn over and pull up a loop. There are 3 loops. Yarn over, insert your hook back down into that same stitch. So I've got 4 loops on my hook back here. Yarn over and pull up another loop. When there are 5 loops on the hook, yarn over, rotate your hook down, grab onto the base of that stitch and pull through. And that's your mini puff. And then chain 1, skip the next stitch, insert into the stitch below the chain space. There are 2 loops on the hook, yarn over and pull up a loop, 3 loops, yarn over, insert the hook, 4 loops on the hook, yarn over and pull up a loop, 5 loops on the hook, yarn over and pull through all 5. So that's what we're going to do all the way along for this row. Chain 1, skip the next stitch in row 5, mini puff in the stitch in row 4 that is immediately below the chain space. So not into the chain space, into the stitch beneath the chain space. Then chain 1, skip a stitch and mini puff into the row 4 stitch that lines up under the chain space in row 5. Continue along following the same pattern. I'm going to stop talking you through each stitch until we get close to the end of the row, but I won't skip ahead. I'll let the video play on so you can watch my hands and hopefully get comfortable with the spiked mini puff. While you're watching this, I would appreciate it if you could hit the like button to let me know that you found this video useful, or you could leave me a comment. In the last few weeks, I've had some comments from Australian crocheters, which is lovely. Hi fellow Aussies, but a big hello as well to crocheters watching in the US, in India, the UK, the Philippines, and in Pakistan. Leave me a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from. I'm going to start sharing the Instagram photos that I'm tagged in with my YouTube community, which means if you head over to my channel page and open the community tab, you'll be able to see some of the awesome crochet creations made by Wheelie Made It subscribers. If you aren't on Instagram and you'd like to share your crochet with me, you can email photos to me. You'll find my Instagram and my email address in the description box. I have 1 chain space left before the end of the row. I'm going to keep following the pattern. I've chained 1 already, so I do a spiked mini puff, working the puff into the stitch in row 4 that sits immediately under the chain space in row 5. After the mini puff, this last mini puff, do not chain 1. You just work a single crochet into that very last stitch of the row. So if you look at my work from above, you can see I've got 1 V left just there, and I'm going to put a single crochet in there to finish the row. It's not a spiked stitch, just a normal single crochet. And that finishes the row. Let me give you a look at what we've got at the end of row 6. The row started with a single crochet. Then without a chain space, we went straight to the first spiked mini puff stitch. From there, it's chain 1, skip the next stitch in row 5, spiked mini puff into row 4, right to the end. But after the final spiked puff stitch, there is no chain space. We've gone straight to a single crochet in the last stitch, which isn't spiked, it's just a normal single crochet. If you started with the same length starting chain as me, you'll have 11 mini puffs in this row. But obviously you'll have a different number of stitches if you started with a different length chain. Let's start row 7. Chain 1 and turn. Single crochet in the first stitch. Row 7 is also all about spiked mini puffs and chain spaces. Again, we're not going to be working the puff stitches into the row we just finished, row 6, but a row below that, into row 5. We'll be locating the chain spaces in row 6 and working into the stitch in row 5 that is beneath the chain space. chain 1, and then work the first spiked mini puff. Locate the chain space from last row and then go into the stitch below the chain space between the two puffs. That is the top of a single crochet, so you should be able to get your hook under the top of a V, and then you just do a mini puff, the same as we were doing last row. And then chain 1, and then we're going to mini puff again into the stitch that is beneath the chain space. So into this stitch here beneath the chain space. And then chain 1, and then mini puff into the stitch underneath the chain space between your next two mini puffs. We'll keep doing the same thing. Chain 1, skip the mini puff in the row below and mini puff into the stitch that is below the chain 1 space between the next two mini puffs. Chain 1, skip the mini puff in the row below, locate the chain space, mini puff into the stitch right under the chain space. I'm going to leave the video running, but I'll stop talking you through each stitch until we get close to the end of the row. Just remember that you aren't working into the last row, you're always going to be working into the stitch underneath the chain space. This will be my 10th and last spiked mini puff for row 7. If you started with a different length starting chain to me, you'll know it's time to stop when there is only one puff stitch remaining in the row below. To finish row 7, chain 1, skip that last puff stitch in the row below and single crochet into the final stitch. This last V here, which is the top of the first single crochet in row 6. In row 7, we've lined up the spiked mini puffs so that there is one between each of row 6's puff stitches. We're starting to see that zigzag effect. Row 7 is a little different from row 6. We still started with a single crochet, but there's a chain 1 space before the first spiked mini puff, and that mini puff sits just to the left of the mini puff in the row below. There is also a chain space after the last spiked mini puff of this row, and the last mini puff sits just to the right of the final mini puff in the row below. So there's one less mini puff in this row than there was in row 6. Row 8, chain 1 and turn your work and put a single crochet in the first spot. Row 8 is the first of the 2 repeating rows that we're going to alternate between for most of the rest of the zigzag panel. The last few rows were our setup rows. I'll call this the A repeat pattern. A repeat rows start without a chain space before the first mini puff. The first mini puff will sit to the right of the first mini puff you can see in the row below, and A repeat rows finish with a mini puff to the left of the last mini puff in the row below, and they also have no chain space between that final mini puff and the finishing single crochet. If you started with the same length chain as me, your A rows will always have 11 mini puffs, or they'll have the same number of mini puffs that you had in row 6. Don't worry if that's not clear, I am going to crochet this row with you. I've done my single crochet, I'm not chaining 1, look down 2 rows, find the first puff. We're going to work before this first puff. If you pull it apart a little, we're going to work between the first single crochet and the first mini puff of row 6. I'll pull it apart a little so you can see the space. Once you've found that spot, crochet a mini puff, exactly as we've been doing in the last few rows. Yarn over and insert your hook. And mini puff. The more of this you do, the more you'll be able to do it by feel, but to start with, you will have to think about where you're placing your stitches. Next, chain 1, and then we'll get to the second mini puff for row 8 and put it in its rightful spot. Find the next mini puff in the row below, this one here. We're going to skip it. Find the chain space after that mini puff, and then find the puff stitch beneath the chain space. We're going to work just to the right of this puff stitch. Pull it apart a little if you need to. That's where we're going to be working. Just yarn over and mini puff. Then chain 1. I'm just going to put this down so I can make it really clear where we're working these puffs. Can you see that the mini puffs from this row are all worked into the spaces between the mini puffs 2 rows down, not the chain spaces between the mini puffs in the row immediately below? The mini puffs in the row 2 rows below. Okay, I'm going to take my hook out and point. So our next mini puff is going to go just to the right of this puff here, in the space just here, which is the chain space to the right of the mini puff. And then we're going to go to the next puff and into the chain space to the right of it here. So make sure you're not working into the chain spaces in the last row. You're always going to be working into the chain spaces 2 rows down. I look at the chain space in the row I just worked, find the puff under it, and find the chain space to the right of that puff. Then I chain 1 and I mini puff to the right of the next mini puff in row 6 and continue along like that. Let's get back to it. I've already chained 1. I skip the puff stitch in the row below. I find the puff stitch that is under the chain space. I find the chain space to the right of that puff stitch and mini puff. Chain 1. Skip the next puff stitch, find the stitch under the chain space and mini puff just to the right of it. And again, chain 1, skip the next puff stitch, find the chain space after it and the puff stitch underneath the chain space, and go in just to the right of that puff stitch. Chain 1, skip the next puff stitch, find the chain space and the puff stitch beneath it, and work a mini puff just to the right of that puff stitch 2 rows down. And that's how this row continues. I'm going to stop talking you through each stitch, but I'll leave the video running so you can keep watching my hands if you want to. Or if you're comfortable, you can use the timestamps in the description box to jump ahead so I can talk you through the stitches that end row 8. I'm nearing the end of row 8, which follows the repeating row A pattern. Rows following the A pattern always have one more puff stitch than the row below has. So when you're near the end of the row like me, if you're unsure whether you need to work one more mini puff or if you're done, have a look at the row below and compare the mini puffs. If there are 10 in the row below, then you need 11 in this row. So I chain 1 and work my last mini puff, which will go in the usual spot. I'm skipping the last puff here, finding the puff stitch beneath the chain space and working just to the right of it. It can be a little tricky to see the puff stitch below the chain space in this last spot. It is a little cramped, so that's where double checking the number of puff stitches in your row can help reassure you that you do need to work one more mini puff. When that last puff is done, single crochet into the final spot. There is no chain one space after the last mini puff in the A pattern rows. Let's have a little look at where we're at. Can you see the zigzag pattern? It's showing up more clearly now we're a few rows into the panel. Row 8 has one more puff than row 7. For me, row 7 had 10 puffs and row 8 has 11. If you started with a different length chain to me, you might like to do a quick count so you're clear about how many puffs your A repeat rows should have. It'll be the same number of puffs as you had in row 6, which was the first row of mini puffs. All of the mini puffs should be worked not into the row below, but 2 rows below. There should be a chain 1 between each of your mini puffs, but double check that you haven't put a chain 1 before the first puff or after the last puff. So that is row 8, and that's the A row pattern for our 2 row repeating pattern. Now I'm going to crochet row 9 with you so I can show you the B row pattern, and then you'll be able to swap back and forward between the A and B patterns for a bit until you're near the end of this first panel. Row 9, chain 1 and turn, put a single crochet into the first spot. So this is the B row pattern. It is really similar to the A row pattern. After that first single crochet, chain 1. That's the first difference. There's a chain 1 before the first mini puff in the B rows. We skip the first puff in the row below, locate the puff stitch that is beneath the chain space, and in that little spot just to the right of this mini puff in row 7, put the first mini puff of row 9. So you can see the spiked mini puffs are worked in the same location in the B rows as they are in the A rows. We're going to continue on like that. Chain 1, skip the puff in the row below, find the puff beneath the chain space, find the spot just to the right of it, and mini puff. So that's the pattern for this row. It's pretty familiar, isn't it? Chain 1 and then skip the mini puff in the row below and work a spiked mini puff. I'm not going to leave the video running this time as you've seen me work the spiked mini puff a lot now. I'm going to cut the video and skip ahead to near the end of row 9, the B row pattern, and I'll show you how to finish the row. If you are working along with me, you might like to pause the video now and switch it back on when you're ready to finish the row. I'm back, and this is my 10th and final mini puff for row 9 following the B row pattern. Row A, the row below, has 11 puffs, so this row must have only 10. If you look at my work, you'll see there are 2 stitches left in the row below before the end of the row. I'm going to chain 1 and skip 1 stitch, which is the mini puff, and then I'll single crochet in the last stitch. So I'm skipping this V and single crocheting in the last V. So that is the B row pattern. Hopefully it's all making sense. The next row you work will follow the A row pattern, then you'll go back to B, then A, and so on. Keep repeating those 2 rows until you have 21 rows of mini puff, which will take you to the end of row 26, which will follow the A row pattern. When I first tried my hand at the zigzag puff stitch, I often found I placed my stitches in the wrong spot and my work got a bit wobbly looking. So I'll give you a few tips. The first is, honestly, it won't matter if you get the occasional stitch slightly wrong. If you want to frog, which just means unravel, you can, but if you look back, say 5 rows and suddenly notice that one of your stitches is a little bit wrong, why not just go with it? You're making a beautiful handmade item. If people want perfection, they buy machine made. Tip 2 is a way to quickly notice whether you've got your stitches in the wrong spot. Have a look at the row you just crocheted and run your eye or your finger along the bottom of the puff stitches. If they all line up, you've done good. If some of them are higher or lower than the others, that means you've accidentally worked your mini puffs either an extra row down or into the chain space above where they should be. Tip 3 is about keeping your rows straight, not adding in or losing stitches. Basically, you need to keep an eye on the number of puff stitches in your rows. A rows have 1 more puff stitch than B rows. To make sure you don't add in an extra stitch at the beginning or the end of the B rows, remember that B rows have a chain 1 before the first puff and after the last puff, while A rows don't. And if you keep an eye on that alternating zigzag pattern, you will notice if you've gone wrong in the middle somewhere, because if you put in an extra stitch, you will get an extra zig or an extra zag, and that will tell you that you've squished in an extra stitch somewhere. So with that last little bit of questionable wisdom, I will leave you to keep crocheting your scarf, and I'll meet you when you finish row 26. I'm at the end of row 26. I now have 21 rows of this zigzagging mini puff pattern, and I'm going to show you how to work the final row of the panel, which will set us up to begin the next divider. If you remember, we started the scarf down here with 4 rows of single crochet, which at the time I told you was half of a divider. Now I'm going to show you how to work the final row of the panel, and then we'll crochet the first complete divider of the scarf. Row 27. Let's get started. Chain 1 and turn. In this row, we're essentially going to be following the B row pattern, but we'll replace the chain spaces between puff stitches with single crochets. You should have finished with a pattern A row, which for me means I have 11 puff stitches in my previous row, and there is no chain 1 before the first puff or after the last puff. Double check that you're finishing on an A row, as it will make it easier for you to follow along with me. I've already chained 1 to get up to height, so I'll start row 27 by single crocheting in the first spot. This is the same way we've started every row in the scarf. Now we're going to change it up. We're going to single crochet in the next stitch too, a normal single crochet, not a spiked stitch. When you look at puff stitches from the back, the top of the puff stitch always looks like it's sitting quite significantly to the left of the body of the puff stitch. So this is the body of the first puff stitch, and this is its top. It might help to look at your work from above. You're going to be putting a single crochet into the next empty V. So far I have 2 single crochets. The next stitch is a spiked mini puff. This bit can seem a little confusing. Please do not work here. We're going to place the first mini puff in the same spot we would have if we had chained 1 instead of single crocheting, which means find the puff stitch that is beneath the chain space in the last row and work a spiked mini puff just to the right of it. We're almost working back a stitch because we're working to the right of the puff stitch that is lined up below the single crochet that we just worked. That is the first mini puff of the row done. Do not chain 1. We're going to single crochet into the next puff stitch in the row below. Remember that when you look at a puff stitch from the back, the top of it sits to the left of the body of the stitch. So this V here to the right is not the top of the puff stitch. This is the spot. If you look at it from above and you pull back the puff we just did a little bit, it is not this first V, it is the second V that I want you to work a single crochet into. Now for the next spiked mini puff. My single crochet is immediately above this puff stitch 2 rows down. I'll work a spiked mini puff just to the right of this puff stitch. I'll go nice and slowly so you can see where I'm inserting the hook. So that is the second mini puff of the row. Let's just check that you're on track so far. There are 2 single crochets at the start of the row, then a spiked mini puff, then a single crochet, then a spiked mini puff. Check that your mini puffs are still creating that zigzag effect with the previous rows, and if they are, you're fine. If you do find that you get a little muddled with the placement of the single crochets, please don't worry too much about it. It won't be obvious if you occasionally work into the chain rather than the puff stitch. Let's keep going with a single crochet in the top of the next puff stitch. We're not working into the chain that is slightly hidden by this puff. So if you look at it from above, the first V that is clear and obvious is this V just here. you're not working into the one that you'd actually have to move your puff to find. You're working into the next one, which should be fairly free and clear. And then we're going to mini puff. Locate the puff stitch immediately below your single crochet, which is this one here, and then go slightly to the right of it and insert your hook. And that's where you're mini puffing to keep that zigzag pattern going. So again, we're up to a single crochet and we're going to single crochet into the next V along. So into the one that is just to the left of the mini puff below. Into this one here. It's the first one that's free and clear. And now we're going to mini puff. Locate the mini puff below the chain space, this one here, and go just to the right of it. Then single crochet. You're not single crocheting into the stitch that you'd have to pull your mini puff back to find. Let that mini puff just sit there and single crochet into the first V after it. This is the mini puff in the row below. You're working into the V that sits above and to the left of that puff. The pattern for this row continues on in the same way. A spiked mini puff and then a single crochet. I'm going to leave the video playing for you so you can keep watching my hands if you need help with placing the stitches, but I'll stop talking you through each stitch. If you'd like to jump ahead so I can show you the end of the row, you can use the timestamps in the description box to do that. If you haven't done so already, I'd love it if you subscribe to my channel. After all, you've been watching for over 40 minutes now. Maybe you could leave me a comment and let me know how you're going with your scarf. It is starting to rain really heavily now. You might be able to hear it in the background. What's the weather like where you are today? I'm looking forward to finishing this scarf and wrapping up in it. This is my 10th puff, so it's the last puff in this row. To finish the row, I'm now going to put a single crochet in each of the last 2 stitches. And that is the panel pattern finished. I strongly recommend that you count your stitches when you finish this row. I have 23 stitches here, 10 puff stitches and 13 single crochets. If you want to count your stitches, I suggest you look at your work from above and count these V shapes at the top of the stitches, and just make sure that your stitch count is what it should be before you start on the divider. Basically, your stitch count shouldn't have changed since that very first row of single crochet that we started with. So whatever your stitch count was back then, it should be the same now. Before we move on to the divider, I'll do my usual thing and go over the row we just crocheted. Your work should look like this. 2 single crochets at the beginning, then a spiked puff, then a single crochet, spiked puff, single crochet, repeating those 2 stitches all the way across until there are only 2 stitches left, where you end the same way you started, with 1 single crochet in each of the last 2 spots. So that's the final row of the panel. It finishes the zigzag pattern off nice and solidly with no chain space gaps at all. Let's start row 28 together. Chain 1 and turn. Starting in the first stitch, we're going to single crochet in each stitch. For me, that will be 23 single crochets. Remember, if you have trouble finding where to place your first stitch in the row, you can count back V's from the hook, and it's the second V from the hook that you put your first single crochet in. This is the first row of the divider. In total, including this row we're crocheting now, you're going to crochet 8 rows of single crochet to create the divider, and then you'll start setting up for the next panel. When you have 8 rows of single crochet, if you need some help with starting your next panel, open up the description box and you'll see there are timestamps there. If you select the one called row 5, panel row 1, it'll take you back to the right spot in the video. One final thing. If you're using solid colour yarn like me, when your scarf is the length you'd like, the final thing you'll crochet is half a divider, which is just 4 rows of single crochet. If you're using multicolour yarn, you might have chosen to start your scarf off with 8 rows of single crochet, in which case when your scarf is long enough, the last thing you'll crochet is the final row of a zigzag panel. That's the point you'll stop crocheting, and so your scarf ends together. I'll leave you to enjoy crocheting your scarf. I'm going to crochet up 8 panels with dividers between each panel and the next. I'll finish with 4 rows of single crochet, and then I'll come back here to show you how to sew the ends together. Here's my nearly finished scarf. Time to sew the ends together. This stitch marker is just keeping the working loop safe. You probably still have your hook in there. To start with, let's cut the yarn and leave a nice long tail for doing the sewing. I usually just guesstimate how long the tail needs to be, but this time I did a little test so I could give you more exact information. You are going to need about 3 times the width of your scarf, and that will be generous. You can see that I have given myself 4 times the width and then 1 extra for luck, and I ended up with over twice the width of my scarf in yarn left after I did the sewing. So I feel fairly comfortable telling you that you'll need just 3 times the width of your scarf, and that will be generous. Okay, imagine that this stitch marker is your hook. I don't want you to fasten off, just to pull the working loop out. Slide that cut tail out. Thread that long tail onto your needle. My tip for threading yarn is to fold it over your needle, creating a crease. Hold the folded creased yarn and thread that through the eye of your needle. It is so much easier than trying to thread the cut end of yarn, and you don't end up with a fuzzy mouth sucking on the yarn to try to get it to behave. The next step is to bring the 2 ends of your scarf together. Make sure your scarf isn't twisted. There are patterns for Mobius strip scarves, but this isn't one of them. This is just the tail from the beginning of my scarf. I like to weave it in after I join the ends so I can weave it in on the other side of the join to make it even more secure. I'm getting this lined up so I'll be able to sew each stitch to the one opposite it. A lot of people sew their scarves together with a whip stitch. To whip stitch, you insert your needle under both loops of the first stitch and then under both loops of the stitch across from it. You pull the needle through and insert it under the next 2 stitches, and so on. When you whip stitch, you don't go back and forth. Think of it as working in a spiral, always taking your needle in the same direction. I'm not a fan of whip stitching. It never looks that good for me, though I've seen other people use it really effectively, and it is definitely faster than the method I use. But of course I like my own method better, or I wouldn't use it. I only sew through 1 loop of the stitches I'm joining each stitch to the one opposite. Then I turn my scarf over and do it again on the other side, sewing through the loops I missed. Let me show you. I don't like to leave this final stitch loose like this, so I make one stitch down here in the body, and that's done. Now I sew once back up so my needle comes out between the two loops at the top of the single crochet, right in the middle of that V. I'm just catching one loop on my needle. I find the stitch that lines up with this one and insert my needle into the middle of that V, and there I've sewn under one loop of each stitch. I go to the next stitch and slip my needle under the front loop so it comes out in the middle of the V, then into the middle of the V of the stitch opposite so I can catch just the one loop, and then to the next stitch along, coming back toward me, just under one loop of each. Back and forth like that all the way along. Hopefully that's making sense, so I'll speed this bit up. I don't know about you, but I love watching speed sewing. It seems so effortless. Nothing like it felt when I actually did it. I had way too much yarn and I felt really clumsy. Make sure you don't miss the final stitch. I've got one more to go. If you have trouble recognizing your stitches, in this case, I think you're better to sew one extra than to risk missing one. Even with the last stitch, I'm only going through one loop of each. So while this does look good, I'm not done. If I turn it over, you'll see why. Because I only sewed through the front loops of the stitches, the seam is really gaping on this side, so obviously you cannot leave it like this. I have a long scarf here. I'll stop filming for a moment to get it into a better position so I can sew this side. Let's get started on sewing this side together. The first thing I'm going to do is get my needle from what is now the back of my work to the side I'm working on. And at the same time, I'm going to bring my needle from above the seam to the other side of the join. I'll sew to the base of this single crochet. And this little bit of extra yarn is the tail from the beginning. I wish I'd sewed it in before I started joining. It's better for the scarf if I do it after, but I think it's getting in the way of the visual. From here, it is just like the other side. So up and down, going through just the one loop of each stitch, connecting it to the stitch opposite it, closing up the gap. I'll speed this bit up now too to make me look much more accomplished at sewing than I really am. Maybe while you admire my sewing skills, you could hit the like button if you haven't already. Surely speed sewing of this high quality is worth a like. They don't cost a thing after all. There, that's finished. Now when I put a bit of stretch on that seam, it doesn't gape at all, and it's not that noticeable. The final step is of course to weave in the tails. Because I finished my seam on this side, I'll weave in the yarn on the other side of the join. You do need to weave in all of the tails from this scarf, including the one from the very beginning and definitely including any in the middle of the scarf. Given this pattern uses quite a bit of yarn, you will have at least a couple of them to do in the middle somewhere. It's the same method whether you're weaving in this one from sewing the seam or if it's one from changing to a new ball. Just sew back and forth at least 3 times so the tail won't be able to slip out and start unraveling. I like to check that the weaving in isn't visible on either side of the scarf, so I flip it over occasionally to check that I can't see the stitches. When that's done, snip it off really close and no one will be able to see the tail and your scarf will stay in one piece. And that is the scarf, completely finished. It is so cozy and soft and warm. Now we've finished the hard part. I'd love it if you popped over to my channel page and had a look at the community section. Like I said earlier, I've started sharing photos of crochet made by subscribers, and after only a few days, I've already got a couple of beautiful items up there. You might find inspiration for your next project when you see what others have been making, or it might just be nice to meet some other crocheters. I'd love to feature your makes too. If you're feeling shy, it can be anonymous, or I can tell the world it's you. My contact details are in the description box. I'll see you next time and keep on crocheting. We're adding a little bit of warmth and beauty to the world, one yarn project at a time. Isn't that a lovely thought?